The world watches in stunned silence, united by a sense of dread and uncertainty. In every corner of the globe, people gather around screens, at home, in bustling city squares, in quiet cafes, drawn together by the gravity of unfolding events. Conversations hush, breaths are held, and a collective anxiety settles over humanity as breaking news flashes across every channel. In the Middle East, a fragile peace has shattered, replaced by chaos and devastation. Once busy streets now lie in ruins, their silence broken only by distant sirens and the echo of explosions. The hopes of millions have been dashed in an instant, as cities like Gaza, Tehran, and Tel Aviv become symbols of a conflict spiraling out of control. Direct military confrontation between the United States, Israel, and Iran is now a terrifying reality. Armored columns roll through the desert, fighter jets streak across the sky, and soldiers steel themselves for what lies ahead. The world's most powerful militaries are now locked in a dangerous dance, each move watched with bated breath. Images of fire and fury dominate screens from New York to Tokyo, as news alerts signal a crisis with global implications. Headlines in every language scream of escalation, and the world's great cities pulse with nervous energy, their citizens glued to updates that seem to grow more dire by the hour. The language of diplomacy has been replaced by the roar of fighter jets and missile strikes. Where once leaders spoke of negotiation and compromise, now the night sky is lit by the flash of explosions, and the world listens to the thunder of warplanes instead of words. Ordinary people in Tel Aviv and Tehran find themselves on the front lines, their lives upended by distant decisions. Families huddle in shelters, children's laughter replaced by fearful whispers, and daily routines are shattered as survival becomes the only priority. Across the region, playgrounds stand empty, and hope feels like a distant memory. Financial markets are in turmoil, oil prices have soared, and the world economy teeters on the edge. On Wall Street and in markets across the globe, traders scramble to respond to the chaos, while the cost of energy spikes, threatening to ripple through every aspect of daily life. Airlines have grounded flights over a region now too dangerous to cross. Airports once filled with travelers are eerily quiet, departure boards filled with cancellations, and families are left stranded, their plans and futures uncertain. The Strait of Hormuz, a vital artery for global energy, is now a war zone. Warships patrol its waters, oil tankers sit idle, and the threat of further escalation looms over one of the world's most critical choke points. The interconnectedness of our world means no nation is immune to the fallout. Disrupted shipping routes, volatile markets, and the fear of further escalation ripple outward, touching lives far beyond the immediate conflict zone. As of March 2, 2026, the world stands suspended between hope for de-escalation and the grim reality of deepening conflict. Diplomats race against time, meeting behind closed doors in desperate attempts to halt the spiral, while the world waits for any sign of progress. How did we get here? What happens next? The answers are complex, woven through years of tension, failed negotiations, and missed opportunities. The world's newspapers and analysts scramble to make sense of the chaos, searching for meaning in the madness. The stakes could not be higher. Leaders face impossible choices, families cling to hope, and the United Nations convenes in urgent session, aware that the decisions made now will shape the future for generations. The world is watching, waiting, and hoping reason will prevail. In the darkness there are moments of unity, candlelight vigils, silent prayers, and the shared longing for peace. As uncertainty reigns, humanity holds its breath, yearning for a return to hope. The crisis erupted suddenly, shattering the uneasy calm that had settled over the region for months. Tensions had been simmering, but few expected the eruption to come so swiftly, or with such force. It began before dawn on February 28, 2026, as most of Tehran still slept. The city's silence was pierced by distant rumbles, the first signs that something extraordinary was unfolding. Under the codename Operation Epic Fury, the United States and Israel unleashed a coordinated barrage of airstrikes on Iranian military infrastructure. The official justification was self-defense, a response to escalating threats from Iran's expanding missile program and intelligence suggesting imminent attacks. Explosions rocked Tehran and other major cities, lighting up the night sky. Missile sites, naval bases, and command centers were targeted with precision, leaving destruction and chaos in their wake. The most shocking outcome was the death of Iran's supreme leader, Ayatollah Khamenei. His sudden loss created a dangerous power vacuum at the very top of the regime, turning a military operation into a full-blown political crisis. The US and Israel quickly declared the mission a success, emphasizing the necessity of their actions. Yet, in doing so, they had crossed a line that many believed would never be breached. For millions of Iranians, the attack was not just a military defeat, but a deep national humiliation. Grief and anger swept through the streets, fueling demands for swift and decisive vengeance. Calls for retaliation echoed from parliament chambers to city squares. The Iranian military began to mobilize, and the world watched anxiously, bracing for the unpredictable fallout. In Washington, President Trump and his advisors monitored the unfolding events from the Situation Room. They framed the strikes as both decisive and necessary, insisting that the world was safer for their actions. But as the sun rose over a battered Tehran, the scale of devastation became clear. The city was changed forever, and it was obvious to all that the conflict had only just begun. Around the globe, news outlets scrambled to cover the rapidly escalating crisis. The world was about to witness the far-reaching consequences of this epic fury, as the Middle East, and the world, stood on the brink of a new era of uncertainty. Iran's response was immediate and fierce. The world watched in shock as Tehran unleashed a barrage of missiles and drones, signaling a new and dangerous phase in the conflict. Iran's leaders declared their actions a direct response to recent attacks, vowing to defend their nation's honor and regional influence at any cost. Within hours, Iranian missiles and drones targeted Israeli cities and U.S. bases across the Gulf. The scale and coordination of the assault stunned military analysts, who noted the unprecedented use of both advanced drones and ballistic missiles in a single, synchronized operation. Air raid sirens wailed in Israel as Iron Dome defenses struggled to keep up with the relentless barrage. The night sky over Tel Aviv lit up with streaks of interceptors and explosions as residents anxiously watched from their windows or rushed for cover. Civilians sheltered underground as missiles struck Tel Aviv and Jerusalem, shattering any sense of security. Families huddled together in bomb shelters, listening to the distant thunder of explosions and waiting for the all-clear. U.S. bases in Bahrain, Qatar, and Saudi Arabia came under attack, putting thousands of American troops at risk. American forces scrambled to respond, activating emergency protocols and bracing for further escalation. The conflict spilled into neighboring countries, with stray missiles landing in Jordan. Emergency responders rushed to the scenes of impact, tending to the wounded and assessing the damage to homes and infrastructure. Meanwhile, preemptive Israeli strikes hit Hezbollah positions in Lebanon, igniting new fronts. Lebanese civilians fled their homes, fearing the violence would soon engulf their towns and villages. The League of Arab States convened an emergency meeting, warning of a full-scale regional war. Arab leaders called for restraint, but their voices were drowned out by the roar of conflict. The Gulf's security architecture, built over decades, was crumbling under Iran's massive retaliation. Oil facilities burned, and security forces across the region were placed on the highest alert. The region was now a battlefield with violence spreading rapidly. Cities once bustling with life were transformed into zones of chaos and fear, as civilians desperately sought safety. The war had become a multi-front crisis with global stakes. World leaders scrambled to respond as markets plunged and the threat of further escalation loomed over the international community. The escalation sent shockwaves through the global economy. Oil prices surged over 30% as the Strait of Hormuz became a combat zone, triggering panic in financial centers worldwide. Airspace closures forced airlines to reroute or cancel flights, creating a no-fly zone over the region. Shipping through the strait halted, threatening global supply chains and causing shortages and price hikes. Stock markets tumbled as investors fled to safe havens. The cost of insuring cargo skyrocketed, and governments scrambled to respond. The war was now being fought on trading floors and in boardrooms, with every citizen feeling the impact. A regional conflict had triggered a global economic crisis. As missiles flew, diplomats scrambled for solutions. The UN Security Council's emergency session exposed deep divisions, with the US and Iran trading accusations and vetoes blocking any resolution. China and Russia condemned the US-Israeli strikes, blaming Washington and Tel Aviv for the crisis. European nations urged restraint but stopped short of endorsing the initial attack. The League of Arab States warned of spiraling chaos, but internal divisions left the region fractured. Gulf states aligned with the U.S., while others feared being drawn into war. The diplomatic front was as chaotic as the battlefield, with no clear path to peace. The world watched as the conflict deepened and alliances fractured. Amid the strategic maneuvers, a human tragedy is unfolding. U.S.-Israeli strikes and Iranian retaliation have devastated civilian areas, leaving homes, schools, and hospitals in ruins. Families in Israel and Iran huddle in shelters, while thousands flee violence in Lebanon and the Gulf. Humanitarian organizations warn of a looming catastrophe as hospitals overflow and supplies run low. Damage to power and water infrastructure threatens a secondary crisis of disease and shortages. Aid workers struggle to reach those in need, hampered by closed airspace and ongoing violence. Children are traumatized, families separated, and daily life shattered. Streets once bustling are now deserted, as fear and uncertainty grip the region. The human cost mounts with every hour. This is the grim face of war loss, suffering, and the desperate struggle to survive. Amid escalating violence, urgent appeals for restraint echo worldwide. The International Committee of the Red Cross reminds all parties of their obligations under the Geneva Conventions: protect civilians and critical infrastructure. Attacks on civilians are war crimes. All sides must take precautions to minimize harm. Humanitarian teams in Iran, Israel, and beyond work under fire to deliver aid, but their safety and access must be guaranteed. The destruction of hospitals, schools, and utilities underscores the urgency of these appeals. Even in war, there are rules. Distinction, proportionality, and precaution must be upheld. The choices made now will shape not just the war's outcome, but its legacy of human suffering. The future is terrifyingly uncertain. The war could widen, drawing in proxy forces and Gulf states, or even escalate to non-conventional weapons. The involvement of China or Russia could turn a regional war into a global confrontation. Yet, a diplomatic off-ramp remains possible if devastation compels all sides to reconsider. Back-channel negotiations could halt the violence, but would require compromise and restraint. The coming days will determine whether escalation or diplomacy prevails. The world stands on the brink, awaiting the next move. We stand at a historic inflection point. The Middle East faces its gravest crisis in generations, with consequences that will echo for decades. Old alliances and red lines have been shattered. The world is in uncharted territory. Oil shocks, supply chain chaos, and economic turmoil are felt everywhere. The failure to prevent escalation is a sobering indictment of global diplomacy. Behind the headlines are stories of families torn apart and lives destroyed. Appeals for humanitarian law are desperate pleas to preserve our shared humanity. The world must not look away from this suffering. Journalists bear witness, providing context and truth in a time of peril. The path forward is unwritten, toward wider war or a return to peace. The world must demand a future defined by diplomacy and humanity.